and welcome to Capital Sports 3.0, where our threesome has now become a twosome with myself and Andrew for one night only, as Alan can't join us. So we're going to kick off tonight with a roundup of the news, and starting with world athletics. And myself and Andrew are just going to discuss the fact that people are clearly becoming faster. So this is on the basis of us discussing McLaughlin's breaking of her own world record within the space of a year. She's managed to break it by 20 seconds, and that is at the current competition, well, finished competition in Oregon in the USA over the last number of days. So I suppose the big question is, are people getting faster, or is it, as Seb Coe would want us to believe, a case that we need to look at a combination of shoes, genetics, better training, bearing in mind she is trained by her husband, who was a former NFL player as opposed to an athletics coach, and the fact that if people are doing all these remarkable things with technology, shoes, and nutrition, it seems unlikely it would happen in the space of a year to break a record by such a big gap. Andrew, your thoughts?
Well, yeah, I think the time frame is the key part in all of that. It's obviously records are always going to be broken over time. People get better, nutrition gets better, science gets better, training gets better. But in that space of time, it's remarkable isn't the word, because it's too quick to be even credible. Obviously, people are going to have to look into preparations, but then it goes back to, for me, to the very basics of sport. Sport's supposed to be equal, fair competition, and the only way you can really investigate it with any and investigate it suggests we're implying that there's wrongdoing. It seems there is a lot that needs to be uncovered, but the only way you can do that is if you analyze everybody. And how you follow everybody's training methods, exactly where they've been, how they've slept, what their emotional state is, what their diet has been, and not just recently, but over years, whatever underlying health issues they know about, perhaps haven't uncovered, that have affected performances. There are just so many intangibles that it's a record. At the moment it is broken is an incredible thing for anybody in any sport, of course, but it sounds awful, but to legitimize it afterwards, which is what we're effectively doing, we're trying to give it credibility or not, is a virtually impossible task. But questions have to be asked. I mean, you don't break records by such margins without something, and whether that's legal or not, whether there is some unfair advantage or not, we need to find out, to either give a full credit, which is quite remarkable, but we'll see.
It's the duration of how long these records have lasted before being beaten is also a big factor.
Yeah.
We're talking about records from the 80s and then suddenly being broken within the space of a 12-month gap. I think Seb Coe was also I omitted to mention it there, one of his big things was he was saying, yes, athletes are being tested more than ever now, but let's remember, when was the last time that we saw so many records being broken in such frequency? And that was, we are looking at the 80s, and we know what the 80s are synonymous with. I think one of the other things is, when we talk about it's not a form of doping, but when we talk about the achievements being made due to advances in technology, in terms of footwear, which is obviously a consideration, maybe less so on the shorter distances, but we all saw the effort that went in when Kipchoge was coordinating his marathon effort. And he had basically pacemakers, everything was timed down to, every aspect had to be right to manage to achieve that on a hugely coordinated level. This is one athlete breaking her own record by such a gap. I just think we have to question how these things are happening, whether it is through some nefarious means or just advances. We just need to question it. And I think that's really important. And from one potentially clean event, I think we're going to move seamlessly to another, as today the Danes took a massive victory in the Tour de France. I think while we have discussed, obviously, for Pogacar up until the very end, he was actually pushing hard. And we actually saw a beautiful moment in the last few days, and I am going to bring this up of sportsmanship where Pogacar was going around a bend and he basically came off his bike, and the Dane slowed down Van der Gaard and waited basically for him to join him so they could continue on together. At that point, the race was very much run. But this is a story, and I suppose I wasn't aware of this, that his brother had also been a cyclist who was actually killed by, I think, a drunk driver. I could be wrong if it was whether or not it was a drunk driver while out on his bike. And I think obviously he celebrated one of his first wins by indication to the sky, and it was very emotional for him. But I just think this is just, it may be a really nice story, and on a tour that has also remarkably gotten faster despite arguably being more challenging. I think we have a lot to question about the tour, so let's enjoy a nice moment of someone winning where it may have some significance to them on a higher level outside of the sport. But I don't know if you've been enjoying the tour or enduring it.
I would have to be honest. I haven't followed it as closely as some have. Enduring would be closer to it than enjoying. The thing for me is, look, I mean, some people enjoy different aspects of sport. I like the dramatic elements of sport, and as an outsider to cycling, if you see a moment that you mentioned with a bit of sportsmanship, that stands out. Now, if I knew that I was going to see those sort of events, that for me adds personality to the sport. If you're watching just sheer endurance, athletic ability, it's a phenomenal thing to watch. But I know you're probably going to get angry at me for this, but Formula One is not something that grips me on an average basis. When you see the dramatic crashes, and I do remember moments, but way back in, was it 2007, 2008? It could possibly have been, was it Lewis Hamilton's first championship win when it was on the last corner that he overtook, I want to say a Honda, I forget, but it was like the last corner of the last race. Dramatic moments I love, but the Tour de France has been discoloured for me by the negatives.
Yeah, and I suppose if we can bring it back almost to the negatives, there was a question put to Wout van Aert when he was asked basically about doping, essentially, and he was asked, he basically said, I don't feel like answering that foolish question. Every time someone wins, that question comes back. Because we're performing, we have to defend ourselves. I don't get that. We worked hard for this. Cycling has changed. We are monitored for a whole year, all the way to our home. And basically, if you're starting, I appreciate that it would be frustrating if you're constantly being asked about doping and you're clean. You'd also be very frustrated if you're being asked about doping and there are questions to be answered. And I think the argument of saying cyclists are being monitored all year round, athletes, like, this is why testing pools exist. Athletes are constantly being tested, but that doesn't mean that doping doesn't slip through. And I think we have to question. We also have to ask why it is a constantly faster tour, why everything is so much progressing over such a short period of time. And also why at the start of the tour we had raids that we haven't really heard very much else about. But we are where we are. And I suppose, look, there's a human element to the victory today that perhaps will not necessarily change how people feel about the Tour de France, but it will certainly change how we perceive the winner for a period anyway. We also need to factor in the last 2 weeks, and I suppose we haven't really touched on this, when we have been watching the weather across Europe.
Yeah.
I don't know how the Tour isn't going to have to look at adjusting. It's going to be a big consideration.
Well, something I would add to that is, and I mentioned this before, probably about a year ago. I forget exactly which topic specifically we were talking about on the show then. But when we talk about doping or gains, marginal gains, whichever form it is, we're saying marginal gains. We're not saying, oh, here, just give it to me, Andrew Flynn, and I can then go and win the Tour de France. I'd still be a million miles off, no matter what sort of edge I would try to get. These people are still putting their bodies through whatever level of clean we're talking. They are still pushing themselves to the absolute limit. What that limit is a combination of factors, but a large part, I would argue the vast majority of those factors are their actual abilities to push themselves mentally as much as physically. So, I mean, I think we had a joking discussion about 6 months ago on the show when we said, how could we make sport more interesting? I think it was Peter P who suggested just let everybody know, because then it's a level playing field. And I wouldn't go quite that far, but I'd say regardless of how clean or dirty someone is, they are still phenomenal physical and mental athletes, and they deserve some level of praise no matter what's happened, just physically to get through the task.
Well, I know what we're going to do. We are going to seamlessly move to a situation and a story that will give you much more happiness than cycling. And obviously, another clean athlete who we have no need to ever question. Where in the world will Ronaldo be next? Where in the world was a great TV show back in the day? So, where in the world? What club is next? Please enlighten me. Where would you like to see him? Where is he going to end up?
Not in Manchester, I'll be honest. I've never quite bought into the significant section of Manchester United's fan base that just, not just, well, of course he's a phenomenal player and his statistics are incredible. He's still scoring goals for fun. He's captaining his country at the age of 36, 37, whatever it is. But there's just a cult around him.
36, 37, I mean, young. Very young.
Sorry. 37 is a fantastically young age. Exactly. That's true. No, but deadly seriously, he is way big. He's one of the very few players in the world that genuinely is arguably bigger than almost any club. And I just think the storylines are just too much. Now, it's clear. It is categorical. He has said he wants to leave for a Champions League club. And I actually don't blame him for that. At this stage of his career, Manchester United don't look like really... They're on a knife edge of possibly qualifying for the Champions League next season. But this is all based on a new manager and style coming in and successfully implementing all of that together. So I don't blame him for wanting to go. But who? I mean, we've seen... Barcelona have signed Bayern Munich's Robert Lewandowski, so that's their star striker. There was talk of Erling Haaland going there, but of course that's Barcelona's slot taken up. But that would have been silly to contemplate that anyway. We know that Barcelona are eking out every single way of selling off future earnings from media, TV rights, which does actually explain how they are able to make this business, but they still can't register the players. So there's no way Ronaldo was going to get Real Madrid.
We will come back to Barcelona in a minute because I think that is a very frightening. Their approach is like basically invoice discounting. It's just very
terrifying. Yes, definitely.
We'll come back to that. So if we've ruled out Barca, you don't see him going across the city. Either do I. To the other team. So where do you think who realistically will have a place for him? Not just financially that they can afford him, but one where he will be getting what he doesn't want a small profile club. He wants somewhere where it's the cult of Ronaldo.
Well, honestly, I think in Europe his options are exhausted. Manchester City financially, PSG, if they had offloaded Kylian Mbappe, which looked like it was going to happen, but obviously has not. He's now effectively sporting director there, so that's him there for at least the season. So PSG out of the equation. Real Madrid, I'm sure, probably would have been near enough. Bayern Munich, I don't think would, because they very rarely spend huge amounts. They have quite a strict transfer policy. I think their record signing is only 70, 80 million, I forget. So realistically, that leaves going to the Middle East. I did see a rumour of, I think it was a club in Saudi Arabia offering a deal effectively equivalent to what Neymar was offered at PSG. But realistically, that would defeat the entire object of Ronaldo leaving Manchester United in the first place. So Juventus, the return there, they're a bit of a mess, and Italian clubs have so little money at the moment. Although Matthijs de Ligt has left, so that's a bit of cash, but it's not Ronaldo cash.
Exactly.
I actually think he's run out of options. I think he'll end up staying because nobody else now, at this stage of the market, will be able to afford him or have a place for him.
Which is a crazy thought that essentially it's because you are too expensive. But the money he draws in, I suppose, from fans globally, maybe to an
Yeah.
extent it can justify. But speaking of cash strapped clubs around Europe, let's move back to Barca. The idea that they are paying for a player by virtue of selling rights into the future, given their financial status in the last 12 months, is a very frightening one. And I have to
Yeah.
wonder, at what point are the governing bodies, like, it shouldn't just be the Spanish coming in now at this stage. It should be because they're buying players on a global level. Someone needs to be saying, like, it's not about it's not about financial fair play. This is a genuine concern as to what is being done and what potentially they are doing to a club into the future. Like, that you can't pay players with magic beans, but like, if I suppose we might just go through what they have done, and I'll let you take the reins there on what their arrangements with their future rights of has been.
Well, I mean, Issa, we've barely gone a day in the last, I would argue, 12 months with people saying, how are Barcelona able to do this? Firstly, I think the one good thing about Spanish football, in a way, is the strictness of how much clubs are able to spend on salaries. And that's explained why they've not been able to register. I think Frank Kessie and Andreas Christensen are not officially registered yet, although they have signed contracts with the club. That is relating to them having to get their wage bill below a certain percent of income. Now, the media rights, image rights in Spain are so heavily weighted towards Real Madrid and Barcelona. They're even miles ahead of third. I believe Atletico Madrid are third in the slice of the pie. And it is a huge amount of money. Now, if they are allowed to, which appears they are, because that's what they've announced, they've sold firstly 10% and now another 15% they want to sell of their next 10 years of TV rights. Was it 10? Is it 20? I forget. Was it 10 or 20? You saw?
I thought it was 10 because 20
I
isn't
think I
ringing
think
a bell with me, but I could be wrong on that. But it's
I believe it was 10 was the figure I'd read, and we're talking about a total of hundreds of millions here. Now, if you sell that off and you bring in that cash, the very first thing they have to do before anything else um, is pay wages. They owe Frankie de Jong 20 million euros. We know that much because that was allegedly or possibly definitely part of the reason his move or negotiations with Manchester United were held up. Now, firstly, they've got to pay off a whole load of debt before they do anything else at all, before they're allowed to register anyone else. But if they have now sold 2.5 years worth of TV rights money, which is an enormous part of their business model,
yeah.
that then means they need to replace that with something else. Now, if you take away Champions League football from that, which is pretty much the only other thing that comes close, other than that they've already signed their Spotify sponsorship deal, so that's a sponsorship deal opportunity. That's gone. They've done that. That then affects how they then use that money. They can't gamble on their extremely talented youth system entirely. Hence, we're seeing a lot of these very well established, but players who will, could well. Frank Kessie has done brilliantly in Italy, but is he really going to do a long-term job compared to the likes of Gavi and Pedri? They've got no choice for the next 2.5 years. They've made their bed.
And I think that is a very good point where now that we've basically killed off Barcelona fans wanting to listen to us for the next 2.5 years, we are going to take.
Nobody likes us anymore. We've been alienated entire countries now, so
we're going to take a brief break and come back with the talking points. So we'll be back in 1 minute. And we are back. So we are going to start off with our talking points. Apologies if there was ice being chewed there. I'm living my best heat wave life in Ireland with a glass of ice. Um, it's really not that warm at all. Anyway, so we're going to kick off with some talking points on one of my favourite sports. We have UFC, which returned for a second time in a year to London last night. And one of the fan favourites in the UK is Scouser Paddy Pimblett, who had a stoppage by submission last night. Paddy, we're going to discuss we could discuss him for a number of reasons, but I'm going to start off, I suppose, with his in the Octagon interview afterwards. Paddy in his social media for quite some time, he initially started by referencing baby Leo, who was a young little boy from Liverpool who sadly died in recent months. He was 4 years old, and Paddy and a number of actual UFC fighters out of Liverpool have been very actively involved in getting him to events and raising profile for assisting with, I suppose, funding some of his care. But sadly, the little boy passed away in the last month and a half, I think now. So Paddy started by dedicating his fight to him, and then moved on to mention his friend who, on the morning of his weigh-in, which would have been Friday, he received a call in the early hours of the morning to basically advise him that one of his friends at home had taken his own life. And I suppose he used the time post fight to really highlight the importance of speaking out and people feeling that they can talk to people. And that is obviously an incredibly important thing to discuss. And I think there is something very difficult for someone to go in those circumstances and pull out any sort of performance in any sort of competition or sporting event, let alone going in to a sport where, like, I watched the weigh-ins on Friday. You would not have thought there was anything amiss with him. He was so hyped up and amped up. He was playing to the crowd at the ceremonial weigh-in. He was playing to the crowd last night when he won. He was like, he played to the crowd initially and then went back for his interview. And you kind of, it makes you stop and go, like, he's been basically on camera for the last 48 hours from the weigh-in on. Once he weighed in, everyone's on him. He's doing interviews with BT Sports. He's constantly up. And then you see what's been going on in the background. And I think for me, it was actually the really right time and the right platform to see someone in a sport that I suppose so much of fight sports is not necessarily macho is the wrong word, because obviously there's a lot of very talented female athletes, but that sort of, we won't talk about things. And I just thought it was a really good way to use a platform.
Yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree. I mean, it's not just him. The sport, as you mentioned, it is a performance. It's not just rigid training. And anybody, even if you're not a UFC fan, you know who Paddy the Baddy is. He's all about character and show, and that's part of his persona, which I guess feeds into his sporting athletic performance. You've got to push yourself. You've got to make yourself more than just a very good trainer. It's a remarkable achievement to be able to, well, just to put on that performance in the weigh-in, in the media performances, yet alone in the actual octagon itself. And I 100% agree that it's exactly the right time to talk about what is most important to you, and it's what is most important to a lot of people. I think it's good that people see those two sides of a sports star. He's a I can't believe I'm going to say this about Scouser, but he's a very likable sort of character. But the person you don't really see until you see genuine, open honesty like that. I would understand completely if after a fight like that, he just wanted to get out of there, turn away from the cameras. Like you say, he's had that for intense for the last 48 hours, but he's used to a lot of attention in general. That would have done a good deal for a lot of people, because it's a slow process, it's a trickle process, but the more people you see do it publicly like this, the more people are likely genuinely to think, well, hang on a minute, if Paddy the Baddy is saying something like this, maybe actually if somebody as outgoing, flashy, performing with so much bravado as this is using that platform to say it, then there's got to be something in it. Maybe actually okay, it's something worth talking about. I really do applaud him for that. Whatever your opinion on him, his history, which is, people can have their opinions. That is
Yeah,
an important thing to do.
and I think there's a very important thing that we need to remember is that a lot of people are sharing this and sharing it's gone viral, the clip of him post fight. And I think the important thing is I've seen people today putting it up online and particularly on Instagram who have absolutely no interest in MMA whatsoever, and yet they're seeing this and this is resonating, and
Yeah.
that's hugely important. I can see we do have a question coming in, which I am going to talk about next, because the other Scouser, the Everton one, who in her post-fight interview, she pointed out that, she wasn't letting people down like Everton. That would be Molly McCann. Molly, who is actually a distant relative of Ireland's own Katie Taylor. She discovered that during a look back into her family history. But there is, of course, Molly's post-fight antics. I am a big Molly McCann fan. I'm not even going to try and hide it. I love her. I even love her French bulldog Frank. That's how obsessed I am with Molly. So last night, Molly not only climbed out of the octagon after her what is now becoming a trademark win with her spinning elbow. She climbed out, was partying with Stormzy, who was up in the front row, was, of course, by the time Paddy came out, she had a yellow wig on and was drinking octagon side. But she also started, and I suppose it's not really shocking for anyone from Liverpool, but she was starting chants of F the Tories. Um, Now, to be honest, I'm surprised she didn't also start shouting F the royal family, because let's face it, Scousers have their views on these things. I can completely look, I can understand the Scousers have a different, they're not English in the same way. They have a definite view. It's like
Yeah.
people in Ireland, people in Cork, they view themselves as separate and apart. Scousers view themselves as their own law unto themselves. And I suppose it's interesting because it almost turned, there was a feel of when you hear people chanting back something that's political. To me, it gives me that sense of, oh God, we're dealing with the MAGA crowd again because they're chanting in inappropriate settings about politics. But by the same token, I think it's echoing a sentiment that may perhaps be universally felt in the UK.
Well,
Please, as
I mean,
as an Englishman, take it away. How do you feel about politics coming into the UFC, and how do you feel about
well,
these things?
Isa, look, I do. One of my biggest bugbears about sport in general is this obsession that people have with saying you shouldn't mix politics with sport. I mean, Jesus, stop using that stick to bash any sport possible. It just stop it, stop it. They are part of the same thing. It's called society. We live through both of them. You know, look, okay.
Well,
People who gather in crowds, who go to sport, you go for a reason because you want to feel part of some sort of family. You go to a football club to watch the team with people who like that football team. You go to support Molly McCann or Paddy the Baddy generally with other people who are interested in seeing the same thing. So to have a similar opinion on other things, there's no point trying to avoid the fact that certain political parties at the moment are perhaps not quite as popular as they would like people to think they are. So you can't take those opinions out of people. If that is what is coursing through your veins at your most, fist pumping, you've just had a euphoric moment. Well, I mean, okay,
it's
you
also kind of
can't.
before we lose all of our Tory viewers, Tory supporting viewers, it is a catchy chant anyway. So we're going to move from that debacle seamlessly to a non-political discussion. Oh no, there we have Stenson. This has all got very awkward. So this week in my mother's world, as I like to call it, when anything golf related, um, basically we have Henrik Stenson having had his Ryder Cup captaincy removed because guess what? He's taking the money and running. So Live Golf obviously are now causing more and more difficulties in the sense that I suppose Henrik Stenson would have been thought of as obviously very highly to come in as the next Ryder Cup captain for Europe. And we're now in a position where more and more golfers are moving. Initially, Live, when they were getting golfers in, they were the kind of like, they were golfers who were so far down the list in terms of world rankings and that you weren't really concerned. Then they got a few of the bigger names in, bit by bit, and you see the likes of Dustin Johnson, who you go, okay, right, well, Dustin will move for money. Phil Mickelson, also, they're both notoriously in need of money despite the millions they make, in the sense of they know how to get rid of it very quickly. And then I suppose Henrik Stenson it's a difficult one for me because it now puts Europe in a position where they not only have to consider getting in a new Ryder Cup captain in relatively quick term because of the fact that Italy is approaching, but it also puts a position where you kind of have to go, when does this end? And at what point do we have to actually accept
Mm.
that Live Golf, for all it stands for, isn't going anywhere? Um, and I think, however much I don't like the idea of this brash, in your face, shorter competition, I think we need to look at, are we going to prejudice other tournaments? And probably golf's only real big, it is the only real big team event other than the Olympics. And not every golfer is going to go to the Olympics. It's the Ryder Cup is such an incredible, unrivaled
Mm.
sporting experience. Like for golf, it is one of a kind, it is totally unique.
Yeah.
And I think if we're going to get to a point where if we're going to miss out on some of the biggest names on both teams, whether as captains or as players, it's a concern.
Well, yeah. I mean, look, Isa, I think you're right. There's no point trying to. You can't force Live Golf to go away if people are going to plow money in wherever that money has come from. It is going to happen. Um, I, I agree with the stance of tournaments or events like the Ryder Cup, saying, look, if you're going to go there, you're not going to be a part of what we are doing because it goes against the values that we stand for. I think you should do that if you want to say, look, we are playing for sport. We're playing, we do care about issues that go beyond the sport. If that is what the Ryder Cup, what the PGA Tour are going to say, then I think that's fine. Does it devalue those tournaments? Well, in the short term, yes, I guess, because you're going to have slightly fewer, well, more stars are going to be leaving. But I think in the long run, it's the thing that has to happen. If Live Golf doesn't go away for a long time, it's just simply a state of affairs that golf as a sport is going to have to deal with. Look, you can't just. You shouldn't be bullied into saying, okay, well, you can do that. You can have the best of both worlds. Well, I'm sorry, you have to make a choice. And if those, I think this Stenson thing is an interesting one, really, because it's like you mentioned, it's the names that Live Golf are going after, not the rankings. It's the names, and that tells the entire story of what they're trying to do. They're trying to build a profile as quickly as they can.
And there's a really interesting point that I just saw Frank Carter has made there about basically how all sports go to where the money is. And I think that's the reality. We can no
Yeah.
longer get to a point where we can say, like, you don't need to look very far from home to see in every area of sport, we're seeing money that is coming from questionable sources seeping in. I suppose in this instance, it's probably the overt nature of the sports washing, the same way people got frustrated about Newcastle, the same way people get annoyed when we see events going to certain countries. We may potentially, and there's been a lot of online speculation just when we're talking about Saudi Arabia, that Sky may no longer be taking the rights to the Anthony Joshua and Usyk fight coming out of Saudi Arabia due to certain confirmations they can't get in relation to stance on certain human rights issues, which is a bold move and one that we haven't seen before. But what we have seen in recent months has been Sky and Boxer taking a hardline stance on other issues, let's say in association with like fighters being associated with the Kinnan group. So I think we're seeing that movement where certain organizations are now saying we actually want in the background to have a strong stance on certain issues, whether it be human rights, whether it be associations. And it'll just be interesting to see how this develops. We
Yeah.
are going to now have our moment for everyone's favorite wrestling man, Vince McMahon, who has graciously stepped away and decided the time is nigh for him to retire before his beloved organization has to pay off any more women. It's been an expensive retirement fund that has been delved out,
Yeah.
but I suppose this is a case of it's not Vince retiring on Vince's terms. I suppose it's jump before someone pushes you out of the plane and try and take a parachute with you.
Yeah, I think that's the cynical but realistic view.
Yeah.
Look, I mean, I think we should at this point very, very clearly separate the two strands of this, the two main strands of this. What he has developed as a business, as a product, as I don't want to say sport because that goes against a lot of my core values as a fan in general. But promotion, it's a skill. It is something that he
He's
has.
changed events and the way events are viewed and how we market events. I
Oh,
I suppose, oh God, we are seeing one of his most horrific moments. I know how that goes. Uh, that was all. Oh God, we really are getting some
I,
detailed
I'm saying,
graphics coming up there. I'm not in charge of these, by the way, but
I
there
think
have
we need
been
to
some.
fire our graphics fella here. Oh.
I think we do, but like Vince went where no man wanted to go to try and bring his sport to a different level and to bring. I suppose it's not just about how he has changed WWE and wrestling as a like so many other sports globally model what he does with events
Mm,
and that sense of pageantry
yeah.
on what he has brought. And I suppose we also saw it with his ventures into football, which obviously were slightly less successful. But what was your
Well,
favorite Vince McMahon moment and why? I think we've just seen mine. Yeah.
well, I'm so that was very. Look, I'd just like to just make it
Close your
clear to
mouth, man.
viewers.
Close your mouth
These
in that
images
picture.
are not pre-prepared. That I said this was my. That definitely is not my favorite. No, the this is going to sound really strange, but it's that meme. It's the meme that has come out of his eyes slowly lighting up bit by bit. And I know it's going to sound a little bit sort of, I don't know what the word is, keyboard warrior esque, but it, I know that's not part of the sport, but it's the demonstration of the pageantry and show and expression. I mean this deadly seriously. It's quite hard to open your eyes that wide, even if you try, if you manufacture it. I mean, I mean, I don't even know what I look like if I try and do it, so I'm not going to. But to put on the utter dedication to that level of showmanship just in 4 photos, I find that quite impressive. Um,
I would say that is a thing that was very common in WWE. We also had the Rock's eyebrow. So, eye twitching and those sort of movements, they're very in vogue.
well, you've got to I could do an eye twitch and I would look like had a stroke or something. But pulling off an eye twitch, it shouldn't sound like it's an impressive achievement because it's just one part of your body moving. But it is what wrestling has become. Now, I mean, we're talking about the positive sides here. So you did ask me what my favourite moment was. I mean, it's not really a moment, but it's just the level of showmanship that not only him, obviously, but that he has spearheaded, that I do find quite unbelievably impressive. I have friends who are around my age, even older, who still talk about.
We've been given
It's
a
still
good graphic. Okay, before we go down a very misogynistic uh, area here, and we're looking at all of Andrew's favorite moments, we are going to, at this point, I am taking charge. I am going to rein it all in. We're not going to keep looking at Vince McMahon. We are going to take a break and come back with hot topics just after this. And we are back. So, Andrew, the mic is yours. What is your hot topic? And because there's only two of us this evening and Alan isn't in charge, I'm happy that we can kind of discuss it as more of a discussion point. You lead the way, and we will then chat about your hot topic.
Right. Well, hot topics I find end up being quite disheartening, sad topics, and I'm afraid this one is another. It was actually quite early last week that I saw a headline, and unfortunately it is becoming more and more common. Ryan Jones, the former Welsh rugby union player who admitted he has been diagnosed with early onset dementia. He's only 41 years old, and it's terrifying, quite frankly.
Yeah.
He said in December, I think it was, he was initially diagnosed with CTE. Correct me if I'm wrong, but CTE is the same or similar condition that has been...
So chronic traumatic encephalopathy. It's basically it's similar to, in the sense of saying similar to Alzheimer's, they only positively confirm post-mortem. But yeah, CTE would be as a result of repeated blows to the head or repeated head trauma.
CTE is the condition the NFL has had a lot of. It is the same thing.
Yeah, that's why they donate so many NFL players, and I suppose it's becoming more prevalent with rugby players. They're donating their brains post-death to various research centres, so it can not only be diagnosed, but also so they can map basically how it affects the brain, see what pathways in the brain are most affected. And it's, in the case of Ryan, I think the really terrifying thing, and not only the horrendousness of the illness, but it's so young and such a long time. It's unimaginable. And I think, I suppose at that age, you've such a life ahead of you of things that you can't even comprehend how they're going to change into the future. Rugby as a sport, a lot of it is community based. A lot of it is about, there's a sense that there is very much a family in rugby. And I think for players who have been injured and have had various reasons to leave the sport, I don't think that disappears. We see it even with things like, I suppose, the huge support for Axel Foley's wife in Munster. There's still that sense of rugby as a community really, really matters. But this is something where no amount of insurance to pay towards any sort of into the future costs is going to address this. And I think it's just terrifying to think of someone at 41. It's just such a young age. On a tangential moment, I met a lady today when I was out walking the dogs, as I permanently am. And I didn't know this lady, and she basically was in her car, stopped, asked if I'd seen a gentleman, said to me what age he was. He was well into his 70s. Her husband, and he had basically wandered off from the house. She said she'd left the front door open. She was fairly upset, but like staying calm. I got her number. I said, look, I'm walking this area. I'll keep walking around for the next while. I subsequently saw family members of hers, because they actually stopped me as well, who were out doing the same thing. And this is a woman who obviously had a husband with a similar condition, or condition where his mental functioning is diminished, who had just wandered out. And you're going, you don't know the rate of degeneration of the brain. And that's the thing that no one can control here, because what has happened to Ryan isn't as a result of a family history in this area. This is as a direct result of the sport he played. And as a result, you don't know, because it has come on at such a young age, you don't know how quickly this is going to progress. And I think as a sport, it's great when you see people come out and they're horrified, they're upset, they want to do more. But the difficulty is, for sports to do more, 2 weeks ago, we had a player, what looked like being rendered concussed on the field, able to stay on. We also have cases of players who seem to suffer repeated concussions, and there's no question about them retiring. So is a sport doing enough by simply being appalled when it happens? And I do think rugby is trying, but it's just becoming, we're hearing more and more of those stories, and you have to wonder how many players over the last few years have suffered post-career and we just didn't hear about them.
Well, this is a really, really, really hard point, because we've seen the legal cases that certain players are launching into this. And whenever I hear about these cases, I totally understand because it's a terrifying situation. You want answers. I think it's very, very difficult, particularly for the very obvious nature of the sport of rugby, to within games specifically. I mean, you can make rules about exactly how the contact is made, and I know they have tried to improve. The referees have been very, very strict about how they deal with certain types of impact, the way, the angle you go in, and that, with early training, I think that's one area that the sport is doing better. Certainly is doing better. The way contact is made at scrums, the way they pause and set the angle correctly. That's a good thing, of course. I think what the sport probably needs to be the strictest at the moment is exactly who decides when a player comes off and how long they should be assessed for afterwards. And it should be taken completely out of the hands of the clubs, in my opinion. It needs to be a completely independent medical expert. I mean, it's a totally different sport and situation, but a very obvious example of football was Jose Mourinho and Eva Canero at Chelsea when he tried to overrule it because he wanted his sports star to get his sports result. It's a medical issue. It cannot be a club employee. And I think perhaps, I don't know how you would implement it, but perhaps the way forward is just very simply the medical officer in charge of a game must be an independent person, just simply not the physio of the club who could be given instructions or may themselves have loyalty, say, oh, come on, you can get another 5 minutes out. We need you for the last 5 minutes of this game. Perhaps that's the biggest step that needs to be enforced.
Yeah, it's a very tough it's a very tough pill to swallow when you think about this man was essentially playing in the last 7 years. He retired in 2015. So, it's very recent
Yeah.
memory. It's no retirement of any sort when you think about how quickly he suffered immediately following on from his departure from the game, and in what is, I suppose, an often walked path in these instances. He initially was diagnosed with depression, and then you suddenly move forward a few years and it's actually you're in the later stages of a diagnosis of not even a life altering illness. It's more than that. It's life ending for a lot of people in your immediate community, and it's just a very, very difficult one to discuss. However, I'm going to brighten this evening up. I'm going to bring the fun because we are going right back to Saudi Arabia. I have mentioned it earlier. So in the build-up, you're going to hear a lot about this over the next few weeks because I suppose I've noticed a trend that I didn't expect to see, and I'm only going to briefly discuss it. But in the build-up to the Usyk and Joshua fight, I think it should be Usyk first when people refer to it personally because he's champion. But anyway, what will be will be. In the build-up, we are going to. I've noticed that I've seen some journalists who I suppose I was surprised to see so because they take differing views from me in a lot of things. Being so openly critical, firstly, of the fact that the fight was going to Saudi Arabia. I know Gareth A. Davies, in particular, he mentioned that from an optics point of view, given everything that's going on in the world, he didn't know if going to Saudi Arabia was the right move for this fight in particular. And I know he's had no issue going to previous fights there. I know he will probably attend, but I just thought it was interesting. It was a move away from the norm to see, I suppose, pundits coming out and really saying, like, being very straight up on this issue. But if the rumours are to be believed, then it looks like Sky are potentially not going to have the rights to it. And the issue here becomes who can afford this fight? Because the disparity between DAZN and what they bid and what Sky bid to win the rights from Saudi Arabia, because in this instance, Saudi Arabia purchased the fight and the rights to it. So they had everything. They were selling the rights to broadcast. And I suppose the big thing is, if it's not Sky, while AJ is such a big name and he's now actually tied to DAZN as opposed to Sky, he's now a DAZN fighter. They've given him a title like an ambassador, or they've essentially given him a ceremonial name so he can come in. He's part of it, tied to DAZN as opposed to his tied to Sky deal. If you don't have the Sky machine behind AJ, while AJ is a huge global name, people aren't turning on DAZN and going, oh, I might get a pay-per-view event. You don't have that level of in your face, what are we going to do here? Are we going to go to this event? And if Sky aren't broadcasting in the UK, who is going to look to take this bite? And because it is a huge opportunity for a big pay-per-view event. And if Sky say the reason they're not going is they're not getting the assurances they want in terms of whatever needs to be said in the background with human rights, whether it's to read out a statement, whether it's to just take a stance on certain things. If they're not getting that assurance, are you going to be the other broadcaster who goes in and says, actually, I'm okay with this? What sort of, is this really a push, or is this just something that will probably be resolved and we'll end up seeing it all on Sky? We'll have 24/7 bombardment. I just wonder, I'm very skeptical until I see anything confirmed, but it's just it's interesting if this is actually happening in the background.
Well, it's again, like you mentioned, it's the who we're talking about a different name, a different sport, but who can afford if the one very obvious option is taken away. The only thing I can really imagine would be something along the lines of an Amazon Prime type broadcaster. I mean, I don't know if I don't know how much they are likely to be at all interested, but I mean, the options are limited, like you mentioned, and I think that is why. Well, that is why we're seeing things like Live Golf going for the really, really big fights. I don't. If you've got the money to spend it, you're going to bid big, because like you mentioned, it's not. It's the fact that I didn't realize it was the entire package, the rights and the fight itself. Well, that's it's a smart move. I mean, if you're talking just in a business sense, I think at this point you'd have to imagine, Esau, that it would be very hard for Sky to climb back down, having made an unusually explicit statement, because that I mean, don't know, but you'd almost imagine that would be slightly damaging to their reputation as a broadcaster, as a negotiator for future deals, which I'd imagine would be disastrous for their business plan. So who knows? Somebody will step in. I can't believe nobody would, but they'd have to pay big.
And a beautiful photo of Usyk coming up there. I would say, like, the height disparity, even when you look at it, is just crazy. To see, there's a lot of, I suppose we see Tyson Fury a lot slagging the fact that AJ basically was beaten by a cruiserweight, which is exactly what Usyk is. But yeah, so to round up in other sports news, very briefly, we now have Verstappen, who is, I think, 63 points ahead in the championship of the F1 after a disastrous day for Leclerc today, when at the front he managed to crash. Now, he since came out and apologised to Ferrari for his horrific driving. Hamilton coming in second with, I think, what was his 300th podium, perhaps, or in his 300th Grand Prix, which is a fairly remarkable achievement. But it is really remarkable. It's levels of driving at my own stage to crash from the front. I have done something similar, not in a Grand Prix, but that's that. And I've just seen Frank has a question: who's going to win? I presume he doesn't mean the Formula One Championship. Who's going to win between Usyk and Joshua? I would say that it will be a case of ending with the words "and still." That's just my own personal view on it. I think if AJ goes in and tries to do what he did the last time, which was trying to box a man who has been boxing for, like, basically well over nearly, I'd say, 2 decades longer than AJ. AJ took up boxing at around 18. So, like, if he goes in and tries to outbox a boxer, it's not going to work out well. And in our last 2 sporting news events for today, we obviously have the fact that Kerry are All-Ireland champions in Ireland. I'm just bringing that up because I like it, and it makes me very happy. It makes my dad happy. It makes my mother happy because my dad's happy. It was actually a fantastic exhibition of sport. The All-Ireland final is something that's truly, it's just a special, it's a bit like the Melbourne Cup is the race that stops a nation. The All-Ireland final, even if you're not involved with the team, you will watch it. And there is a brilliant show that's on the night before, which has been missing for the last few years due to COVID. It's called Up for the Match. It's basically where they go out into the participating counties and find the most ridiculous of stories, people, houses, and put them all on national TV for us all to enjoy. And it's just,
Sounds great.
it was a great day. But I actually think there was one really heartwarming moment where Pat Spillane, who has been a stalwart on Irish TV for decades, he was a player for Kerry himself and is now retiring from his slot on the Sunday game. He told a lovely story about well, it wasn't a lovely story, it was just a heartbreaking story about his own father passed away some years ago, but the Galway and Kerry ended up playing in that year. And he just mentioned the fact that his dad had been a selector for the Kerry team, and to see it all come full circle because his dad hadn't seen the victory like today. It was really lovely to see the human element to the GA. He had two nephews on the field who obviously it was a huge day for their community, but it was a really great event and a very close game, which obviously is what you always want in a final. But as I've managed to get Kerry in there at the end. That was the really important thing. But as we go on to next week, I am just going to warn before Alan tells me not to. Next week, we are going to be discussing Space Jam. We might discuss sports events, or we will do an entire show just on Space Jam because it is everyone's favourite movie. We might delve into Space Jam 2, which I'm planning on watching this week. I've been saving it for a special occasion, and this could be the special occasion. So next week, there will be some Michael Jordan, there will be lots of laughs, and we will probably discuss some sports news too, or at least try to, and we may even get our co-host back. Who knows? If we don't, we'll cope just fine without him. So from the twosome, I am going to say good night, Ihawa. Can you give me something in various languages, please, Andrew, other than English? Perfect. Good night and God bless.